the price of everything and the shape of the world, trade routes, choke points, and the geography of power. Chapter 1. The world is not flat. Welcome. In the next 50 minutes, I am going to change the way you see a map. Not in a vague, geopolitical thriller sort of way. In a precise, almost brutal way. Because once you understand where things come from, how they move, and why certain strips of water and patches of ground are worth dying for, you cannot look at a newspaper headline, a fuel price, or a shipping delay without seeing the machinery underneath. We are going to talk about trade routes, about the narrow passages where half the world's oil squeezes through on a Tuesday morning, about the minerals sitting under deserts and rainforests that your phone cannot exist without, about gray rhinos. You know the term black swan, the unforeseeable catastrophe, the thing nobody saw coming. A gray rhino is different. It is the enormous animal standing in the middle of the field. Everyone can see it. Everyone knows it is there. And everyone is pretending it is fine. The Strait of Hormuz, the South China Sea, the rare earth monopoly, the freshwater crisis. All gray rhinos. We are going to name them, understand them, and by the end of this, you will have a mental map of how the world actually runs. Chapter 2. The Arteries of Civilization. Imagine the global economy as a human body. The factories are the organs, the cities are the brain, and the trade routes, the shipping lanes, the pipelines, the rail corridors, they are the arteries. Cut one artery, and things get very bad very fast. About 90% of everything you own at some point traveled by sea. The shirt on your back, the coffee in your cup, the lithium in your laptop. All of it at some point loaded onto a container ship and moved across an ocean. And the global shipping system is not a wide open highway. It is a network of funnels. Narrow, strategic, irreplaceable funnels that the entire modern world depends on. We call them choke points. Let us visit them one by one. The Strait of Hormuz. This is perhaps the single most important strip of water on the planet. It sits between Iran and the Oman Peninsula, and it is only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through that gap flows roughly 20% of all the oil traded in the world, every single day. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Iran itself, all of their oil exports pass through here. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, even for a week, oil prices spike globally, airlines start making emergency calculations, and governments start sweating. It nearly happened in 2019. Iran seized a British-flagged tanker. In 2023, Houthi attacks in the nearby Red Sea forced dozens of shipping companies to reroute around the entire African continent, adding 2 weeks and enormous cost to every voyage. 2 weeks for every ship. That is what one regional conflict in a place most people cannot find on a map does to global trade. The Suez Canal. Built by Egyptian and European hands in the 19th century, opened in 1869, and still one of the most consequential engineering projects in human history. The Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Without it, ships traveling from Europe to Asia must go around the entire Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That is roughly 9,000 extra kilometers. About 15% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal every year. In 2021, a single container ship called the Ever Given ran aground and blocked it for 6 days. 6 days. That caused supply chain disruptions that rippled through dozens of industries for months. Furniture, electronics, car parts, all of it backed up like a motorway after a fender bender, except the motorway is one of the main arteries of global commerce. The Strait of Malacca. If Hormuz is the oil choke point, Malacca is the Asia choke point. It runs between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, and roughly 80% of China's oil imports pass through it. So do enormous volumes of goods flowing between East Asia, South Asia, and the rest of the world. Singapore exists in large part because of Malacca. The city-state sits at the eastern entrance of the strait and became one of the wealthiest places on Earth by being the world's toll booth and service station at this single critical junction. China is acutely aware of its vulnerability here. If the United States Navy, which patrols much of the Pacific, ever chose to blockade the Strait of Malacca, China's economy would begin to suffocate within weeks. This is one of the reasons China has been building artificial islands in the South China Sea, developing alternative land routes through Central Asia, and investing heavily in ports from Pakistan to East Africa. Not for tourism, for survival. Chapter 3: The Ground Beneath Your Feet. Now let us talk about what lies underground. Because geography is not just about water, it is about soil, about rock, about what happened to the planet several 100 million years ago and what that means for power today. Oil and gas. You already understand why these matter, but consider the distribution problem. The countries with the most oil are mostly not the countries with the most industrial demand. The Gulf states, Russia, Venezuela, Libya, they sit on the reserves. Europe, China, Japan, the United States historically, they need the reserves. This structural mismatch is the root cause of almost every major geopolitical conflict of the last 100 years. It is why Britain maneuvered in Iran in the 1950s. It is why the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. It is why Russia uses gas pipelines as political weapons against Europe. Now meet the new oil. Rare earth elements. You have probably heard the name, but perhaps not the details. Rare earths are a group of 17 metallic elements with names that sound like they belong in a fantasy novel. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. They are not particularly rare in the Earth's crust, but they are almost never concentrated enough in one place to be economically worth mining. Except in China. China controls roughly 60% of the world's rare earth production and an even larger share of the processing capacity. These elements are not optional. They are inside every electric vehicle motor, every wind turbine, every smartphone, every precision-guided missile, every MRI machine. In 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with a Japanese Coast Guard vessel near disputed islands in the East China Sea. Japan detained the captain. China, without officially announcing an embargo, quietly stopped rare earth exports to Japan. Japanese manufacturing began to feel it within weeks. Japan released the captain. That is what raw material geography looks like in practice. Lithium, cobalt, copper. The green energy transition is often discussed as though it will free us from resource dependency. It will not. It will simply change which resources we depend on. Lithium, the core of almost every battery in electric vehicles and grid storage, is concentrated in a region called the Lithium Triangle. Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile together hold more than half the world's known reserves. Bolivia alone may sit on the largest single lithium deposit on the planet. Bolivia is also landlocked, politically volatile, and has spent decades watching foreign companies extract its resources while its population remained poor. The country has been extremely reluctant to allow the kind of foreign investment that would bring lithium to market quickly. This is a gray rhino. The world needs lithium for the clean energy future. The lithium is there. The political conditions to get it out are complicated, and the timeline pressure is intense. Cobalt is even more concentrated. About 70% of the world's cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country with extraordinary natural wealth and extraordinary political instability. The conditions in some cobalt mines there are among the most dangerous on Earth. Child labor is documented. And yet virtually every battery-powered device in your home depends on that cobalt getting to market. This is the uncomfortable geography of the clean tech revolution. Chapter 4. Water, the gray rhino no one wants to talk about. Oil gets headlines. Rare earths get worried policy papers. Water gets almost nothing. And water is the one resource that nothing on Earth, not a single organism, not a single economy, can function without. The global freshwater situation is quietly, steadily deteriorating. Only about 3% of the water on Earth is fresh, and of that 3%, most is locked in glaciers or deep underground aquifers that take centuries to replenish. The Ogallala Aquifer sits beneath 8 states in the American Great Plains. It is one of the largest underground freshwater reserves in the world. It is being drained at a rate roughly 9 times faster than it can naturally refill. The agriculture that feeds a significant portion of North America depends on it. And it is going away. Internationally, the Nile is an example of where water politics become genuinely dangerous. Egypt has been civilizationally dependent on the Nile for 5,000 years. About 90% of Egypt's water comes from it. Ethiopia is building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, which will give Ethiopia electricity and development, but will reduce the water flow downstream to Sudan and Egypt. Negotiations have stalled repeatedly. Egypt has, at various points, suggested military options. This is not a metaphor. This is a real dispute between real countries with real armies over a real river. Similar tensions exist between India and Pakistan over the Indus River system, between Turkey and its downstream neighbors over the Tigris and Euphrates, between China and Southeast Asia over the Mekong. Water wars have been predicted for decades and have mostly not happened yet. That word "yet" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Chapter 5. Reading the headlines differently. Let us bring this back to your daily life. You open the news. You see a headline about tensions in the South China Sea. Before today, you might have vaguely registered it as a diplomatic dispute. Now you see something different. You see the Strait of Malacca. You see China's rare earth leverage and its fear of blockade. You see the artificial islands as unsinkable aircraft carriers in a geographic chess game. You see why the United States spends so much political energy maintaining alliances in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. It is not about ideology. It is about who controls the water. You see a headline about the European energy crisis in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Before today, that might have seemed like a political conflict. Now you see the Nord Stream pipelines running under the Baltic Sea. You see Germany's decade-long bet on cheap Russian gas as a rational economic decision that became a catastrophic strategic vulnerability. You see the scramble to build LNG terminals to receive liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the United States. You see the geographic logic of why Turkey positioned itself as an indispensable transit country. You see why Poland and the Baltic states spent 15 years warning Europe about Russian energy dependency and were largely ignored. Geography does not lie. Politics, economics, culture, they can be shaped and reshaped. But the Zagros Mountains still separate Iran from Iraq. The English Channel still separates Britain from the continent. The Sahara still divides Africa. and the narrow straits of Hormuz and Malacca still sit where they have always sat, waiting to matter enormously. Chapter 6. The Shape of the Future. Geography is not static. Climate change is redrawing the map. The Arctic is melting, and as it melts, it is opening shipping routes that did not previously exist in a commercially viable form. The Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coastline and the Northwest Passage through Canada's Arctic archipelago are becoming navigable for longer periods each year. For a ship traveling from Shanghai to Hamburg, the Northern Sea route is roughly 40% shorter than going through Suez. Russia has been investing heavily in Arctic infrastructure, icebreakers, and port facilities for years. Canada is now realizing it may have sovereign territory that the world suddenly wants to use. Greenland, which most people previously associated with ice and irrelevance, sits at the junction of these new Arctic routes and contains significant mineral deposits. This is why it has attracted political attention that would have seemed absurd a generation ago. Meanwhile, the glaciers feeding the rivers of South Asia are retreating. The rivers of the American West are at historic lows. The breadbasket regions of the world are being stressed by heat and drought in ways that agricultural systems were not designed to handle. The geography of food production is shifting. Canada and Russia, paradoxically, may become more agriculturally productive as their northern regions warm. Countries near the equator face the opposite trajectory. Migration will follow. And migration reshapes politics in ways that are already visible and will become far more visible over the coming decades. Conclusion: the map is the message. We started with a simple idea. The world has a shape. And that shape determines more than most people realize: who has power, who is vulnerable, what things cost, and why conflicts start. The gray rhinos are visible. Resource concentration in politically unstable regions, choke points with no real alternatives, water tables that will not last, Arctic routes that change the strategic map, a clean energy transition that creates new dependencies even as it dissolves old ones. None of these are surprises. They are large animals standing in a field. The question is whether the people and institutions making decisions choose to see them, plan for them, adapt. And whether you, now that you have the map, can read the world a little more clearly than you could 50 minutes ago. I think you can. Chapter 7. When the map breaks, crises past and crises coming. History is not a sequence of accidents. Most of the large disruptions of the modern era, the oil shocks, the famines, the trade collapses, the military interventions, had geography written into them from the beginning. The conditions existed, the pressure built, and then something small, a war, a storm, a political miscalculation, released it all at once. Let us look at a few of them clearly. The 1973 oil embargo. This one changed the modern world, and most people have only a vague sense of why. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated military attack on Israel to reclaim territory lost in the 1967 war. The United States resupplied Israel with weapons. In response, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced an embargo. They would not sell oil to the United States, the Netherlands, or any country that had supported Israel. The result was immediate and savage. Oil prices quadrupled within months. In the United States, petrol queues stretched for blocks. Odd, even rationing was introduced based on license plate numbers. Speed limits were lowered nationally to save fuel. The entire post-war assumption of cheap, abundant energy, the foundation of American suburban life. The highway system, the car culture, the cheap flights collapsed overnight. The embargo lasted only 5 months, but it permanently rewired how governments thought about energy security. Strategic petroleum reserves were created. Nuclear programs were accelerated. The search for non-OPEC oil intensified, leading directly to North Sea exploration and Alaskan pipeline development. And the political relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, already close, became something more like a mutual dependency that has shaped Middle East policy ever since. One political decision in a narrow coalition of desert states caused petrol queues in Ohio. That is geography. The Somali piracy surge, 2008 to 2012. Somalia collapsed as a functioning state in the early 1990s. Its coast, which runs along one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, the Gulf of Aden, the entrance to the Suez Canal from the east, became ungoverned territory. By 2008, Somali pirates were seizing container ships, tankers, and cargo vessels, holding crews for ransom, and operating with remarkable sophistication. At its peak, piracy in that corridor was costing the global shipping industry an estimated $7 to $12 billion a year. Not in ransoms alone. In rerouting costs, insurance premiums, armed guard fees, naval escort coordination, and the sheer economic drag of uncertainty in a critical transit zone. The international response involved naval coalitions from NATO, the European Union, China, India, Russia, and several other nations, all operating simultaneously in the same waters. Countries that could barely agree on anything were patrolling together, because the alternative, losing reliable access to the Suez corridor, was unacceptable for everyone. Piracy dropped sharply after 2012, due to a combination of naval pressure, hardened ships, and some improvement in coastal governance. But the lesson is not reassuring. A single failed state on a strategic coastline was enough to destabilize global trade flows and require a multinational military response. Somalia did not have a powerful army. It did not have nuclear weapons. It had a coast. The 2021 Suez blockage, 6 days that cost $20 billion. We mentioned it earlier, let us go deeper. The Ever Given was one of the largest container ships ever built, nearly 400 meters long. It was carrying roughly 18,000 containers when it ran aground on March 23, 2021, wedging itself diagonally across the entire width of the canal. Within hours, a queue of ships began forming on both sides. Within days, that queue had grown to over 400 vessels. Every day the canal was blocked. An estimated $9 billion in trade was delayed. Livestock ships were stranded with animals running out of food and water. Fuel tankers were stuck. Consumer goods shipments that had already survived the chaos of the pandemic supply crunch sat motionless in the heat. Salvage teams worked around the clock. They had to wait for a high tide, dredge sand from around the hull, and use a fleet of tugboats to slowly free the ship. It took 6 days. 6 days for one grounded ship, to cost the global economy an estimated $15 to $20 billion in delayed trade. The deeper story is not about one ship. It is about how lean global supply chains have become. Just-in-time manufacturing, the system that Toyota pioneered and the rest of global industry adopted, means factories do not hold large inventories. Parts arrive exactly when they are needed. Which means any significant disruption, anywhere in the chain, propagates almost instantly into shortages, production halts, and price spikes. The Suez blockage was 6 days. A serious conflict in the region, or a sustained infrastructure failure, would be measured in months. Future breakdown number 1. The Taiwan semiconductor crisis. This one has not happened yet, but it is the gray rhino standing closest to the fence. Taiwan produces roughly 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced chips. A single company, TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, makes chips that go into iPhones, data centers, military systems, cars, medical devices, and virtually every piece of modern electronics. There is no real alternative. Building a comparable fab facility takes 5 to 10 years and costs tens of billions of dollars. The knowledge base, the supplier ecosystem, the engineering talent, it has accumulated in Taiwan over decades. China considers Taiwan part of its territory and has never renounced the use of force to reunify. A Chinese military action against Taiwan, whether an invasion or a naval blockade, would almost certainly disrupt semiconductor production. The consequences for the global economy would dwarf anything the Suez blockage caused. Within months, car production would halt, consumer electronics would become unavailable, data center expansion would freeze, military procurement programs would face critical component shortages. The United States, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea are all now spending enormous sums to build domestic semiconductor capacity precisely because this scenario is not theoretical. The CHIPS Act in the United States, similar programs in Europe and Japan. They are building an insurance policy against a gray rhino they can see clearly and hope never charges. Future breakdown number 2. A Sahel collapse in the migration cascade. The Sahel is the strip of semi-arid land stretching across Africa just below the Sahara: Chad, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Sudan. It is one of the poorest, hottest, most politically fragile regions on Earth, and it is getting hotter. Since 2020, there have been military coups in Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, and Chad. French forces, which had been operating counter-terrorism missions across the Sahel for over a decade, have been expelled from several of these countries. Russian Wagner Group mercenaries moved into the vacuum. Underneath the political turbulence is a simple and brutal physical reality. The Lake Chad Basin, which once covered 25,000 square kilometers, has shrunk by more than 90% since the 1960s. The communities that depended on it, fishermen, farmers, pastoralists, have been forced into competition over what remains. That competition fuels violence. That violence fuels displacement. That displacement fuels extremism and political instability. Now multiply that dynamic across a region of roughly 300 million people, under increasing heat stress, with weak governments, with a demographic explosion producing millions of young people with no economic prospects. The migration pressure on Europe's southern borders, which already triggered significant political convulsions in the 2010s, is structurally likely to intensify. This is not speculation. It is arithmetic. Future breakdown number 3. The Mekong Dam Wars. The Mekong River rises in the Tibetan Plateau and flows through China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam before emptying into the South China Sea. It is one of the most biodiverse rivers in the world and the Food Security Foundation for roughly 60 million people in its lower basin. China has built 11 large dams on the upper Mekong, called the Langkang in Chinese territory, and plans more. The downstream effects are measurable and severe. Water levels in the lower Mekong have become erratic. In dry seasons, flow drops dramatically because China is holding water in its reservoirs. In rainy seasons, unexpected releases from Chinese dams cause flooding downstream. Fish populations in Cambodia and Vietnam have declined sharply. The Mekong Delta in Vietnam, one of the most productive rice-growing regions in Asia, is experiencing increased saltwater intrusion because river flow is insufficient to push back the sea. There is no international treaty governing the Mekong that China has signed. China has not refused to negotiate. It has simply declined to commit to anything enforceable. This is a slow-motion resource conflict affecting the food security of tens of millions of people, largely invisible in Western news, operating entirely through the physical logic of a river. Chapter 8. What can actually be done? It would be easy at this point to feel that the world is simply a collection of structural problems with no real solutions. That would be wrong. Some of the most important responses to geographical vulnerability are already underway. They are not perfect, they are not fast enough, but they are real. Diversification of supply chains. The pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war did something that decades of economic theory could not. They convinced companies and governments to stop optimizing purely for cost and start optimizing for resilience. The concept is called friendshoring. Instead of sourcing components from wherever they are cheapest regardless of political risk, you source them from countries that are politically aligned with you, or at least stable and trustworthy. Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Morocco are all benefiting from this shift as manufacturing relocates away from China. Apple now assembles iPhones in India. Intel is building chip fabs in Ireland, Germany, and Ohio. This does not eliminate geographic vulnerability, but it spreads it. It means no single choke point can take down an entire industry. Strategic reserves, the buffer against shock. After 1973, the idea of strategic reserves spread beyond oil. Today, the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve can release up to 1 million barrels per day into the market to cushion price shocks. Coordinated releases by the International Energy Agency member states can multiply that effect. China has been quietly building strategic reserves of rare earth elements, grain, and other critical materials for years. The European Union, stung by its gas dependency on Russia, has been rapidly filling gas storage and building LNG import capacity. The logic is simple: you cannot eliminate geography. But you can buy yourself time when geography turns against you. The green energy transition as geopolitical strategy. Renewable energy is discussed primarily in environmental terms. But from a geopolitical standpoint, it is one of the most significant restructurings of global power in a century. Sun and wind are, with very minor exceptions, domestically available. A country that runs on solar panels and wind turbines does not need to worry about what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. It does not need to maintain a navy in the Persian Gulf. It does not need to make uncomfortable political accommodations with authoritarian petrostates. Germany's pivot away from Russian gas, painful and expensive as it has been, is also an exercise in buying back strategic independence. Countries in the Middle East, whose entire economic model is built on fossil fuel exports, understand this perfectly well. It is why Saudi Arabia is building a city of the future in the desert called NEOM, and why the UAE is investing heavily in tourism, finance, and technology. They are trying to build a post-oil economy before the oil era ends. Whether they succeed is one of the more consequential geopolitical questions of the next 30 years. Water technology and transboundary agreements. The water problem is the hardest one, but it is not without tools. Israel has perhaps the most sophisticated water management system in the world, driven by necessity. It recycles roughly 90% of its wastewater for agricultural use. It leads the world in drip irrigation technology, which delivers water directly to plant roots and cuts agricultural water use by roughly half compared to traditional flood irrigation. Desalination, converting seawater to freshwater, has become dramatically cheaper as technology has improved. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel now run large desalination programs. The cost of desalinated water has dropped roughly tenfold over the last 40 years. The challenge is energy. Desalination is energy intensive, but if you pair it with cheap solar power, which desert countries have in abundance, the economics start to make more sense. On the diplomatic side, the Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan, signed in 1960, has survived 3 wars between the two countries. It is one of the most durable international agreements in history, precisely because both sides understood that the alternative was a water war that neither could afford. The Nile needs something similar. Whether the parties can get there is another matter. International institutions and their limits. The World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the World Bank. These institutions were all built in the aftermath of World War II with a specific purpose: to create rules and mechanisms that would prevent geography and power from determining outcomes entirely. To some degree, they succeeded. Global trade has been more stable and more predictable over the last 70 years than in any comparable period in history. But they have limits. They are only as powerful as their members allow them to be. China ignores WTO rulings it finds inconvenient. Russia left the Council of Europe. The United States, under various administrations, has undermined WTO dispute mechanisms by blocking appointments to its appellate body. The rules-based international order is not collapsing, but it is being stress-tested in ways it has not experienced before. And the stress is geographic at its root. Rising powers want their geography to count for more. Established powers want the rules that cemented their advantages to remain in place. The tension between those two things will define much of the next 50 years. The most important thing individuals can do. And here is the part that does not usually appear in geopolitics lectures. You personally cannot fix the Mekong. You cannot resolve the Taiwan question. You cannot replenish the Ogallala Aquifer. But you can read the map. Geographical literacy, understanding where things come from, what they depend on, and what happens when those dependencies are stressed, is one of the most undervalued forms of intelligence in modern civic life. It means you are harder to deceive by politicians who offer simple explanation for complex structural problems. It means you understand why certain policy choices that seem expensive or inconvenient in the short term are actually insurance against catastrophe. It means you can participate in democratic decisions about energy, trade, migration, and international institutions with something closer to real understanding. The map is not just a picture of the world. It is an argument about the future. And now you can read it.